So it's good to see you again. Thanks for welcoming me back. And this evening I'll be exploring. Can you hear me okay? Let's test that first. There was a problem last time, I remember. I'll be exploring only one question, and that is how to use mindfulness to practice beyond doubt, even doubt that's reasonable. And I'd like to begin by telling you a story as I did last time. This one was published in 1877 by a man named Gustave Flaubert in his famed book, The Three Tales. You know it? Guess not. It's the story of the legend of Saint Julian Hospitator, as we call him in the South, Hospitator. Saint Julian was born under a curse. And he grows up to commit crime. And then he does what it takes to make reparations. So there's a curse, there's a crime, and then there's reparation. So the story begins with a noble lord who lived in a castle long, long ago. And the castle was in the middle of a forest on the slope of a hill. The paving in the courtyard was spotlessly clean, like the stone floor of a church. The noble lord was always seen wrapped in a cloak of foxskin, and after many adventures, he had taken a wife of noble birth. Then, after much praying to God, she bore him a son. Well, this was the occasion of great rejoicing, and a feast was held that lasted 3 days and 4 nights. The young mother didn't join the feast, but she lay quietly in her bed. And then one night, in a shaft of moonlight, she saw an old man with a rosary and a beggar's scrip over his shoulder. He was a hermit. And he approached her and he said, "Mother, rejoice. Your son is a saint." Is this going out? And then he disappeared. So none of the other servants had seen him. But the next day, the same old hermit appeared to the noble lord as a gypsy with a plaited beard. "Ah, your son. Much bloodshed, much glory." And again he disappeared. The idea that his son was destined for splendor captivated the noble lord, and even he doubted that he had heard it. Both he and his wife kept this hermit visitation a secret from each other, but they continued to dote on young Julian because they now thought of him as someone specially chosen by God. His mother taught him to sing at 7. An old monk taught him the Holy Scriptures, the Arabic numerals, the Latin alphabet. But one day during Mass, little Julian saw a mouse. And later on, he scattered cake crumbs to draw the mouse out of its hole. And then he tapped it with his stick and noticed that it bled. So he quickly wiped the tiny blood stain on his sleeve and he told no one. But then he took to killing birds, great numbers of them, and he delighted in his mischief. Soon he was old enough to learn how to hunt, and so he killed everything: heron, kite, vulture, crow. After a while, Julian became like a wild animal himself. One day, on the far side of the valley, at the forest's edge, Julian saw a stag and a hind and their fawn. And he killed the fawn instantly without even thinking about it. But just then, a great black stag leapt forward and said, "Beware, a curse lies upon you. One day, O savage heart, you will kill your mother and your father." This was the curse. Well, Julian was seized with panic, and all night he dreamt of the great black stag. For 3 months he took to his bed, and when he was recovered, he vowed that he would never hunt again, ever. To cheer him up, his father gave him a sword, which one day he dropped from above and nearly sliced his father in half. Then he took up the javelin, and he one day threw it at what he thought was a stork, but it was his mother's bonnet. And so Julian, not wanting his, he fled the castle, never. So he enlisted in an army, and he kept on killing, till one day he defeated the enemies of the emperor. And out of gratitude, the emperor offered him a handsome reward, which Julian declined over and over until 2 tapestry curtains were drawn aside to reveal the emperor's daughter. And she was a beauty. Julian was overcome with love, and they married, and he no longer went to war. Times he would burst into tears, and so when she inquired about his family, like, "Where are you from? Where are your family?" he told her of his terrible years, and she assured him that they had to have been accidents, and insisted that he take up hunting again. Oh, he did. But as soon as Julian left on a hunting trip, an old man and an old woman, Julian's parents, came to the castle. Bent over at the back, they were leaning on a stick, and she fed them a great meal to their satisfaction, even gave them her own bed, and closed the casement window so that they could get good sleep. While try as he might, Julian could not kill the animals, somehow managed to get away. And so he decided he would return to killing men instead. When Julian came home in the dark, early morning light, he saw some clothes on the floor and bumped into the nightstand covered with dishes. And in a rush, in a fury, he jumped on the figures lying in the bed and he stabbed them repeatedly. And when he was finished, when he saw his wife standing in the doorway, holding a lamp in her hand, and upon seeing what Julian had done, she dropped the burning lamp to the floor. Well, Julian picked it up, leaned it toward the bed, and there in front of him were the corpses of his mother and his father, stretched on their backs with holes in their hearts. This was the crime. Julian went away never to return and wound up begging for his daily bread in every corner of the world. This is the story of Saint Julian, which begins with fear, it tangles with love, and it almost ends in doubt. A fundamental yet profound fear of making direct contact with our feelings of fear, feelings of alienation, lead us to doubt reflexively, to shut down and to kill off that which holds the potential to nourish us deeply. Julian seemed to be born with a heart inclined to shut down, to kill off potential. And so he hardly needed a reason to fly into action when he experienced what he thought was a betrayal of his wife. When he doubted that his wife was who he thought she was. Obviously, there was a high price to Julian's disillusionment. But we all have our disillusionments, our doubts. When in some way our doubting instincts make us like wild animals. We sense betrayal or fear. We sense doubt, especially the reasonable doubts. And instinctively, we daggers, so to shut down the threat that we shut down the potential for love. We get it that it's hard. I know it's hard for me. It's hard to stay open. It hurts to stay open, to give the benefit of the doubt. Hurt and doubt, it happens to all of us. But the big question, my friends, is when we come into contact with doubt and the pain and the fear that often accompanies doubt, what weapons will we draw upon? When we encounter fear and doubt in our own beds, when we stumble across the clothing of doubt at our own feet, how will we respond? One way is by taking the path of the Buddha's teachings. The highest goal of the Buddha's wisdom is steadfast, unshakable, unmovable, and abiding deliverance of the mind. Deliverance from all limitations, all fetters, all bonds, all defilements that spoil the mind's purity. Unshakable deliverance from all obstacles that hinder the mind's progress and tie it to the wheel of suffering. That is the highest goal of the Buddha's teachings. We have all, every one of us, encountered many obstacles to this progress, many roadblocks. We get sick. We get old. Our loved ones die. We lose our jobs, our careers. We launch our children into the world. We get divorced. It can all be very, very painful. In fact, depending on the circumstances, these and many other life events can truly hinder our spiritual growth and development at times. But there are 5 such hindrances that the Buddha mentioned most often in his teachings, obstacles that hinder spiritual progress. 1, sensual desire, which the Buddha referred to as a pot of water. that's been mixed with color so that it's impossible to see your own face. Number 2, ill will is the second hindrance that spoils the mind's purity. This is like boiling water. Sloth and torpor is number 3. The third obstacle on the road to liberation, which is like stagnant water. Number 4, restlessness and remorse is the fourth hindrance, which is like wind-tossed water. Just can't sit still, just can't rest. And number 5, the topic that we're talking about tonight, is skeptical doubt, which is like muddy water. The Buddha equates skeptical doubt to a man traveling through a desert. He says, fully aware that others who have traveled in the same path may have been robbed, killed. And that's us. We've learned to respond to uncertainty with anxiety and fear. That's our response. Always imagining the worst. It's called the negativity bias in psychology. We move towards something we love, someone we love, and then out of fear we stop. We pause, we look over our shoulders, we check it out, and then we move forward. And only when it feels safe do we engage. And maybe it never feels safe. Maybe we never get there. Maybe we chicken out and turn back. In this way, the Buddha teaches that we stop more frequently than we walk. Together, and only with great toil and great difficulty and great strain on the relationship do we arrive at the shores of surrender, if we get there at all. But why? It's because we're doubtful. We, like Saint Julian, are caught in reactivity. We get hooked in fear and anxiety. But the Buddha called this suffering. Whatever is happening, we're wanting it to be different. We're pushing it away. We're shutting it down. We're killing it off. Whatever it has to teach us. We're reflexively reaching for our daggers and killing the potential that it holds, that it has to nourish us. But there is a time. There is a time when shutting down in doubt seems like a reasonable response. How do we stay present in our practice in those times when it's really hard to know the difference between reasonable doubt and unreasonable doubt, between real or memorex, whether we're actually being betrayed by our lover or whether we are actually betraying ourselves? How do we know the difference? How can we know the difference? And since it's much easier to understand why the Buddha would encourage us to practice, to relinquish doubt, to practice beyond doubt when doubt seems unreasonable, the doubts that we know are unskillful, the worry, the fear, the anxiety, the inadequacy, when is it then wise to practice beyond the doubts that seem reasonable? How do we stay present with and learn from the doubts that seem reasonable? According to attorneys Gerald and Kathleen Hill, to give us an understanding of what reasonable doubt is, they discuss what it is from a criminal sense. And they put it this way: reasonable doubt is not being sure of a criminal defendant's guilt to a moral certainty. Thus, a juror, a judge sitting without a jury, must be convinced of the degree of a crime, such as murder instead of manslaughter, beyond a reasonable doubt. This is what the jury is told by the judge in what's called jury instructions. However, it is a subjective test, since each juror will have to decide if his or her own doubt is reasonable. On July 13, 2013, Lizette Alvarez and Kara Buckley wrote the following in a New York Times article. George Zimmerman, the neighborhood watch volunteer who fatally shot Trayvon Martin, an unarmed black teenager, igniting a national debate on racial profiling and civil rights, was found not guilty late Saturday night of second-degree murder. He was also acquitted of manslaughter, a lesser charge. After 3 weeks of testimony, the 6-woman jury rejected the prosecution's contention that Mr. Zimmerman had deliberately pursued Mr. Martin because he assumed the hoodie-clad teenager was a criminal and instigated the fight that led to his death. Mr. Zimmerman shot Mr. Martin on February 26, 2012, in self-defense after the teenager knocked him to the ground, punched him, slammed his head repeatedly against the sidewalk. In finding him not guilty of murder or manslaughter, the jury agreed that Mr. Zimmerman could have been justified in shooting Mr. Martin because he feared great bodily harm or death. They conclude, but because of Florida's laws, prosecutors had to persuade jurors beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Zimmerman did not act in self-defense. A shortage of evidence in the case made that a high hurdle, legal experts said, end quote. And so it is without question that the ruling in this case has divided our nation. On July 23rd, just 8 days after the verdict, a Pew Research Center poll said that 86% of Black Americans expressed dissatisfaction with the verdict, compared with only 30%. At the same time, a Washington Post ABC News poll found similar statistics. 9% of Blacks approved of the acquittal compared to 51% of whites. Now, regardless of where you come down on the verdict, and we are not going there, we are not. There's hardly a soul in this country that wasn't touched by it in some way. But I don't think that what has divided our country around this case has as much to do with race or even justice as it had to do with what over 2,600 years the Buddha described in the last and perhaps the strongest hindrance that muddies the mind, that blocks unity, that blocks harmony, and yes, that even blocks justice. It has to do with the barrier that has not changed in over 2,600 years. It hasn't changed since 1877 when Flaubert wrote The Three Tales. It hasn't changed since 2012, the Martin Zimmerman trial. That barrier is doubt. It was doubt that divided us, doubt that divides us still. Reasonable doubt, but doubt no less, that muddied the water that justice used to wash her hands. Some argue that the reasonable doubt in the Zimmerman-Martin trial was itself unreasonable, and that our nation will never thrive beyond it. Others argue that the reasonable doubt hurdle in the trial was more than reasonable, and that our country needs to get over it. But getting over it is a lot easier when the reasonable doubt appears unreasonable, when it appears cloudy to everybody, anybody looking in the pot. What this case proves is that regardless of whether you think the verdict should have gone this way or should have gone that way, regardless of whether a man walking in the desert should feel nervous, should feel cool as a cucumber if he hears a squirrel or bird in the bush, regardless of whether we agree that Julian in the story should have killed his parents or shouldn't have killed his parents, the fact remains that doubt hinders. Doubt hinders. Charlotte Jo Kobeck wrote even as she was dying. She said, "We can talk about oneness until the cows come home. But mindfulness is embodying experience. Whatever is arising, we bring mindfulness to it. Mind, feelings, body, even doubt. This mindfulness, it increases, expands the heart, and it gets bigger and bigger. And it can hold even doubt. And it can keep it from dominating or even overwhelming us. At first, the heart is constricted. It's always contracting. But when we practice mindfulness, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it never ceases to grow. When we practice, we can notice doubt arising. We can touch it. We can see the limits of doubt, and we can start right there. Suzuki Roshi wrote, "You know, the pain and the suffering that you're feeling right now, it will never end." He was a Buddhist, not a Baptist. Baptist wouldn't have said that. By and by, sweet by and by. Right? It will never end. So how do we make suffering a practice? What kind of skillfulness have you learned from working with doubt? The mind itself, the self, the mind, it's all conditioned by so many factors in life. Right? It's conditioned by our family and our culture, the schools we attend, the forces in our environment, all shape our sense of self. Sinisra, one of my favorite teachers, love her. She once said this: feudalism, capitalism, communism, apartheid all shape our experience. Patriarchy over each other, over the earth, bringing about a profound ecological crisis. Positive effects, gains in technology, loss of placement, loss of connection, and in the midst of it all, We pick up teachings, we go to retreats, we sit like a crazy person. But we don't pick up enough to help us come into direct contact with this conditioning. The hindrances are real. They're real obstacles. But how do we make contact with it? The muddy water of doubt says, I can't. I can't. It's too hard. It's too much. But every condition, every single condition, has freedom at its core, freedom at its root. Arena Weissman, who's taught here before, I believe, she tells of an encounter with a pipe carrier, medicine woman. And she was conducting a medicine wheel gathering at one point, and she responded to a young woman who threw herself in front of her, wanting so badly to die, doubtful that her life would ever get any better. You know what she said? She said, each one of us is given a path of healing. And that path is never greater than our capacity to hold what we're given with clarity and compassion and equanimity. I still remember to this day where I was when I heard that invitation. When I realized on some level, probably for the first time in my life, I could in fact hold whatever I'm given, whatever I'm feeling, without suffering. I had spent, when I heard this invitation, I had spent too many years battling depression. Too many. Looking for something, anything outside of myself to make it go away. But you know what? At some point in my practice, right about the time I heard this invitation, I realized that it didn't have to go away in order for me to be happy. Imagine that. I could learn how to hold it for the rest of my life if necessary, for 10,000 lifetimes if necessary, with lightness and spaciousness and respect and honesty, without resisting however it needed to be. That was a game changer. The Buddha teaches that that capacity, this capacity, is right inside of you, right inside of you. It's right inside of us. And it's a capacity that we can cultivate when we incline the mind toward it. When we are motivated to break through the blockade of doubt. After 27 years of imprisonment, Nelson Mandela recounted that he made it doubtless because they could imprison his body, but not his mind. The guards at Robben Island, as you probably know the story well, they spent 27 years picking all the flowers off of his body. But they couldn't stop the spring in his mind, in his doubtless mind. You know what Michael J. Fox said when he was asked, how do you keep acting with Parkinson's? What are you doing? If he ever doubts that he can keep it up. He says, I don't ignore it. I don't deny it. But if I let it affect everything, it will own everything. If I don't allow it to be bigger than it is, then I can do everything else. And that was the Buddha's doctrine. The goal of his teaching was simple, to show us how to practice beyond the right, the wrong, beyond the guilty or the innocent verdict, beyond the pleasant and the unpleasant, the love and the hate, the reasonable doubt, the unreasonable doubt. How? How do we move beyond the curse of doubt and the crime of reacting to it with anxiety reflexively? And how do we move to make reparations, to free ourselves from suffering? The 13th century poet Rumi wrote this: out beyond ideas of right doing and wrong doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. And when the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about. Ideas and language, even the phrase each other, doesn't make any sense. Want to know what happened to Julian in the story? Everywhere Julian went, he confessed in humility what he had done. He confessed. And as a result, he was not received. He was repelled. People hated him. They were afraid of him. They damned him. He found no rest for his soul's weary. Even in his dream, where he was haunted night and day by the murders he had committed. He tried being a hero, rescuing people from this or that danger. But nothing allayed his sorrow. Nothing took away his grief. He prayed for death, but death wouldn't come. Weighed down, deep down by his sins, he came to a violent river that no one had ever before dared to cross. And Julian, older by now, he saw an old boat stuck in the mud on the side of the river. And then he found the oars to the boat, and he devoted his life to helping people cross it. And they flocked from everywhere. Finally, the river could be crossed. Some cursed at Julian even as he took them across the river, but Julian remained humble. One night, an old leper with hideous sores all over his body asked Julian to take him across the river. And Julian obliged. And then the leper says, "Now take me to your hut. I have no place to live." And Julian obliged. Then the leper asked for food. And it was hard because he was so smelly and scales from his sores were flaking off his body. But Julian obliged, gave him the little food he had. And then the leper was thirsty, so he asked Julian for drink. And so Julian gave him all the milk he had on his person. He just obliged. Very near the time of the leper's death, he says, "I'm cold. Give me your bed." And Julian gave him his bed. "I'm still cold. Give me your blanket." Julian humbly offered his blanket. The sores on the leper were oozing, and the stench of death was so profound. The leper says, I'm I'm very near death and I can't shake this cold. Can you get in bed with me? So Julian, I'm sure he thought about it. But he got in bed with the leper. I'm colder still. Take your clothes off. So Julian took his clothes off and he curled up to the leper. He wanted the warmth of his body. And finally, the leper says, I need you to lay on top of me, feet to feet, chest to chest, mouth to mouth. And Julian obliged. And when there was no more resistance, nothing left, no space left between him and direct contact with his worst fear, the leper bore him straight to heaven. This was the reparation. Making direct contact with life. Not avoiding, not drinking, not eating, not smoking, not bypassing the life that we have and the pain in the life we have. Not resisting it or auto-reacting to it, but making direct contact. Letting ourselves directly experience whatever is happening. Like Rilke wrote in his book, Letters to a Young Poet. You know that book? He says, let everything happen to you. Let it happen. Beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. Beautiful Dharma teaching. No feeling is final. And so the way to repair our resistance to life, to repair the hindrance of doubt, is to meet it, to appreciate it, to make contact with it. That is the core of freedom. We get hurt, we get wounded, and naturally we cling to feelings of doubt and mistrust, and you might even harbor a degree of, shame or anger or hurt so pervasive that you wake up one day and find that in your attempt to shut out the pain that someone has caused you, you have also shut out the love. And you might even notice a doubting pattern across your life and wake up one day to suddenly realize just how many people you've shut out and all that shutting down. And as a result, how lonely and alone and empty it's left you feeling. So in exploring how we keep the heart open, how to stay present, we're also exploring how to incline the mind to stay when it wants to run. How to allow doubt, which is a natural human response to arise in us, to arise, but not to dwell in the shadows of doubt. Not to allow it to cut us off from each other, as this trial has done, and not to allow it to cut us off from ourselves. A defendant was on trial for murder, and there was evidence indicating guilt, but there was no corpse. In the defense's closing statement, the lawyer, knowing that his client would probably be convicted, he resorted to a trick. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the lawyer said, I have a surprise for all of you. And he looked at his watch. Within 1 minute, the person presumed dead in this case will walk into the courtroom. And he looked toward the courtroom door. The jurors, somewhat confused and stunned, they all looked at the door eagerly. A minute passed and nothing happened. Finally, the lawyer says, "Actually, I made up the previous statement, but you all looked. And you looked with anticipation. So I therefore put to you that you have a reasonable doubt in this case as to whether anyone was killed, and insist that you return a verdict of not guilty." The jury, clearly confused, retired to deliberate. And a few minutes later, the jury returned and pronounced the verdict of guilty. "But how?" inquired the lawyer. "You must have had some doubt. I saw all of you stare at the door." The jury foreman replied, Oh, we looked at the door, but your client didn't. He didn't look. So sometimes it's hard to just note the presence of doubt and let it go. When you're sometimes uncertain whether it was someone's intention to harm you, then you waver and vacillate. Although deep down inside, we know that the very barriers that we erect to keep us safe are the same barriers that we use to build our own Robben Island prison. We also know what makes the prison wall of doubt come crumbling down. What makes it easier to keep the heart open, to get over things, to let grudges go, to let things die. And that is the practice of staying connected. I'll tell you one more joke, because I'm almost out of time. I want to get this one in. The mother of Buck, a horse whisperer, tells a joke at the end of the movie. She says, a sea captain sees an armed pirate approaching in the distance and yells to his men, "Get me my red shirt, so that if they hit me, they won't see me bleed." Moments later, to the captain's profound shock and dismay, he looks over the horizon and he sees a dozen other armed ships behind the first one. And he yells to his men, "Get me my brown pants." That joke. It's a good joke. So we, like the sea captain, we can learn from our direct experience with everything that happens. We can learn everything we need to know about not identifying with strong emotions and not pushing them away. And finally, my friends, I want to leave you with, what the Buddha offered us as a way of working with it. There's a place where we can go. We can go to the refuges. Instead of going to automatic pilot, instead of going into reactivity, you can ask yourself and say this to yourself: when, not if, I find myself caught, hooked in the web of doubt, even reasonable doubt, I take refuge in the Buddha, the potential for awakening in this life. And when I find myself caught and hooked in the web of doubt, even reasonable doubt, I take refuge in the Dhamma, the way of understanding and love. And when I find myself hooked, caught, snagged in the web of doubt, yea, even reasonable doubt, I take refuge in the Sangha, The community that lives and practices and grows and thrives and comes together, even when our nation is coming apart. The community that lives in harmony and awareness. May it be so.